And a special welcome to Dr. Sarah Aiston, who currently works as a senior lecturer in the Department of Education and Social Justice at the University of Birmingham. One of her specialities is women in higher education leadership, so she's here to talk to us about that tonight. Prior to working in Birmingham, Sarah worked at the University of Hong Kong, so a very interesting career, and has a long-standing commitment to researching the position and the status of women working in higher education, and also as students, both from a historical and contemporary perspective. So delighted to welcome you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Looking forward very much to that, because of course in Share we have researched similar issues and had fantastic conversations with you about that. I should just explain that we are streaming this seminar. Look forward to those. So I think that's all I have to say at this point. Welcome again, though, and over to you, Sarah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. To say thank you very much to Barbara, and thank you for Cheer for inviting me to come and share my research with you this evening. I was supposed to be here last term, but as Louise Morley, the director for the centre, rather humorously said, I was temporarily silenced by flu. So I'm really glad that I've got here today from the far-flung north to be with you this evening. And so obviously the focus of what we're going to be looking at today is women academics. Oh, okay. Okay then. Well, we have extensive research that demonstrates that women fail to move through academic hierarchies and reach the most senior ranks and leadership positions in the profession. And this underrepresentation of women as academic leaders and in those most senior ranks is a global phenomenon. Now, of course, how and why this academic gender gap remains is incredibly complex, and the research we have suggests that there are numerous factors that contribute to what is an enduring problem. Of this paper that I'd like to share with you this evening is what I think brings a sort of new conceptual dimension to understanding this very complex but enduring problem. And the research I'm going to share with you this evening is based on interviews with 35 women academics from 3 world-leading universities, research-intensive universities. And what I'm going to introduce is this concept of the silence and silencing of academic women. Now, the context for the research I'm sharing with you is actually the Hong Kong higher education context, which, as Barbara pointed out, I worked in that context for 5 years before returning to the UK. But I'll just give you a little bit of insight into the Hong Kong higher education sector. So, Hong Kong has 8 publicly funded universities by the University Grants Committee. It's a very strong sector relative to its size if we consider world rankings both at institutional and disciplinary levels. So, for example, 4 out of those 8 universities are in the top 100 QS world rankings. But women are woefully underrepresented in this context, in the most senior leadership roles. When I started looking into this issue, there was no publicly available data, so I got a research grant to actually carry out our own mapping exercise of the gender profile of the Hong Kong Academy. And what we found was that at the level of dean and above, across those 8 institutions, there were 110 positions, but only 8 women. So that's 7.3% of that sector holding those most senior roles. So just to give you a bit of background to the research, the research was funded by the Research Grants Council in Hong Kong, which is similar to our own research councils here in the UK. And the grant had 2 central research questions. First of all, I was interested to look at how and to what extent the universities were supporting the career progression of women academics and entry to senior leadership roles. And then the second question was looking at the enablers, barriers to career progression and entry to those roles within this context. And it's this second question that I'm particularly talking about and sharing with you this evening. So as I noted, this particular conceptual framework came about as a result of the interviews with the 35 women academics. It was a stratified sampling method, and I chose to interview those women who were at 3 of the institutions in Hong Kong: the University of Hong Kong, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, which are this sort of the world leading institutions with very, very strong research profiles globally. So in terms of the composition of the sample, you can see 17 assistant professors, 8 associate, 10 full professors. We have 13 interviewees from science and engineering and 22 from social sciences and humanities. And in terms of ethnic background, 28 of the interviewees were Asian, 20 were Chinese, 8 non-Chinese, and then we had 7 non-Asian participants. Now, when we came to analyse the data, the interviews typically lasted between an hour to 2 hours, and we came out with an incredibly rich, deep data set. So it was quite overwhelming. So we did use NVivo initially to sort of manage the data, if you like. And also it gives us the ability to look across questions, then correlate different sort of variables, for example, discipline and rank with particular responses. But having done all of that, then looking at what came out, what struck me was this notion of silence and silencing as a concept. So what I did was I went back to all of the interview transcripts and just reread and reread and reread, because what seemed to come out to me was this was about silence on different levels. So why academic women remain silent, and then how academic women are silenced. So this conceptual framework was very unexpected and for me emerged from the interview data. Now, as I started by saying, we do have extensive research in this area now, and increasingly in all different parts of the world, which is very exciting. And the current literature does sort of give us a hint towards this notion of silence. So, for example, Luke talks about the politics of science. So she's talking about how women academics encounter difficulties in speaking out because the majority have very limited power. It's okay. And Luke talks about gender stereotyping and expectation placed on women's behaviour, that women are labelled too assertive or bitchy when they do speak out, and to a certain extent they are interrupted or ignored. Then we have the issue of male-only discussions and silencing. So this research was really looking about elite men's networks, and that women were often not encouraged or welcomed to participate in male-only discussions. And so they argue that speaking in academic settings might be associated with the danger of a verbal assault or intimidation. Then there's the idea of academic hierarchy and silencing. So this study, which was from Iceland, was talking about marginalised groups, so women and junior staff are allocated academic housework. And so the norm becomes not to challenge workload allocations, and then voices remain unheard. And then, looking at Louise Morney, who is the director of the centre, and our good colleague here, Barbara, their work looking at women in South Asia, where silence was a strategy to avoid unwanted attention or gender-based violence. So for those authoritative women who spoke out, it was viewed as sort of transgressing gender norms. So we do see aspects of this notion of silence in the current research literature. But I think what I want to suggest, and I'd be really interested in your opinions, is that actually we can take this notion of silence and silencing and sort of put it forward more as a conceptual framework by which we might understand the barriers that women face in terms of their career progression. Now this was the exciting part for me, and this was the sort of theoretical framing that seemed highly relevant to looking at this notion of silence and silencing. So this is micro-inequities. So what are micro-inequities? They're small events which are hard to prove, covert, and often unintentional. But research indicates that much of the discrimination women face in the academy is almost intangible. So it makes the case for studying micro-inequities as a mechanism to uncover bias and discrimination. Now Brennan talks about micro-inequities. Brennan is actually a philosopher, a brilliant philosopher, but who has an interest in actually thinking philosophically about discrimination within her own disciplinary context. And she's saying that at the individual level, when we encounter micro-inequities, the accumulative effect can lead to damaged self-esteem and lead to withdrawal. But importantly, the case is to be made for not looking at each act individually, but for studying the aggregate effects and patterns that, in order to understand bias and discrimination. And you'll see from the illustrative quotations I'm going to give what these micro-inequities look like from the perspective of the interviewees. But highly relevant also, and relatedly important, is the study of micropolitics also. So this is a nice quote from Louise, in which she says, micropolitics focuses on the ways in which power is relayed in everyday practices. Seemingly trivial incidents reveal the subtle and sophisticated manner in which power is achieved. So that gives you a bit of an insight into the theoretical framing when we're talking about silence and silencing. We're talking here about micro-inequities. We're talking about micropolitics. So in putting together this conceptual framework, I've sort of broken it down into two parts, if you like. Part A and Part B, and then each part has two sections to it, which I'm just going to sort of explain my thinking at this point. So the first part I've called the silence of socialization constructing the feminine. And so in part A, if you like, what I'm talking about is internal silencing. And so this is the idea of the inner voice. And I'm going to use throughout this conceptual framework illustrative quotations from the interviewees to sort of show what this looks like. Now, again, research indicates that internal barriers play a significant role in women's career progression. So, for example, lack of confidence. And these barriers are often acknowledged as a result of socialization and gender stereotyping. And our argument is as follows. It's this socialization that silences women in the academy almost from the offset, if you like. So let's just have a look at an example of what we mean by this inner voice. And I'll just give you a minute to read that quotation. So we see here, this interviewee makes reference to the female personality, women not being assertive enough, and goes on to comment that women feel obliged to give explanations when they can't do something, which in turn sends out a sign. And so it's a signifier of difference, if you like. So she goes on to talk about how when women do say no to something, they then go on to explain, and she observes that her male colleagues seem far better at just saying no, not, I can't do it, no explanation, whereas she's observing that her female colleagues, herself included, are more likely to say yes, I'll do it, or if they do say no, I won't do it because, and then this long explanation. And she concludes by saying, we're almost conditioned into behaving in a particular way. But the reluctance to speak up, to say no, has significant consequences, as this interviewee, this professor in social sciences and humanities, went on to explain. So for her personally, this resulted in a huge amount of service responsibilities in her position, which she observed her male colleagues were not undertaking, and that therefore impacted on the allocation of time given to other aspects of her life, and she particularly flagged up her research and also, importantly, her family. Here's another example. So an associate professor in social sciences and humanities. So here we see, she's saying, many women always feel, myself included, I've struggled a lot. I always feel my points are not good enough, my delivery is not convincing enough, I'm not clever enough, I'm not good enough to be where I want to be. And this mentality has made a lot of women choose to be, ordinary women, such a waste. And I think this final quotation, to sort of wrap up this sort of point, is a good example. So again, we get back to this personality issues, gender issues. Women are still taught to be quiet, not to be aggressive. So I'm sure there's a gender dimension. So what we observed from the interview data was that women were talking about themselves or observing their female colleagues and looking about the barriers to career progression and how they're linked to this, linked to the socialization and gender stereotyping about how they should or might act or behave in the academy. So the next part it again relates to this notion of internal silencing, but it's actually the recognition that silence and conformity serves as a strategy. So we have these very strong gendered societal clues which guide our behaviour and our decisions on how to negotiate academic space. And so internal silencing relates to silencing as an inner strategy. So let's have a look at an example of what this silence looks like. I'll just give you a moment to read that quotation. So I think this quotation also touches on another significant issue. So this particular interviewee is placing the onus of responsibility upon women speaking out. So it's up to the women to speak out. Don't sit in meetings and not be heard. And in the literature, this is referred to as fixing the women. So that training for women should focus on building women's confidence and self-esteem, developing their assertiveness, competitiveness, and aversion to risk. And so in the literature, this is referred to as a deficit model, whereby women are positioned as being in need of development to gain the same prized attributes as men. But this actually is not that straightforward, and I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later on. I think for those of you who are not sort of familiar with this field of study, I guess you probably all have heard maybe of the lean-in phenomenon. It's that kind of thing. It's sort of, well, if women just lean in, everything will be okay. I have huge issues with that phenomenon. So let's have a look at a clear example of internal silencing as a strategy. So this is about women making the conscious decision to be quiet because it's to their, their advantage to do so. We've been hiring friends, and I mean that's just been very incestuous, and we've hired one woman since, and she's junior. She's totally got to do with these guys. She's got to align, and she sits in meetings, and she's very mousy, and she's not like that. But she's mousy with them because she wants their favour, and I understand that. So this interviewee is observing her female colleague as moderating her behaviour to gain favour with male colleagues. Now, there are examples of when women are faced with very derogatory sexist remarks that women's internal analysis still leads to silence as the best approach. It's a strategic decision. So let us take an example. So I'm going to give you the background to this. This is from one of the female scientists. No, actually, the quote explains it well. So here we have the metaphor of academic women being positioned as academic housekeepers is literally applied in the comments made by the interviewee's senior male colleague. In the academic literature, within this field of study, we talk about women being positioned as these academic housekeepers or academic mommies, if you like. Now, this interviewee did comment because she says, well, I said it's not because I'm a woman, the lab's in good order. But the statement, I did not say anything, indicates that the interviewee, for me, didn't challenge her colleague's gender stereotyping in the way she might have liked to. And I think there's a strategic recognition here. There would have been little point because she says, I did not say anything. I will never win. I don't want to fight for that, which again probably hints at, I don't want to have to fight, my way forward on the basis of my sex. So this next part is about external silencing. So we've talked in the first part, in part A, about internal silencing. We've talked about the inner voice. We've talked about being quiet, perhaps as an internal strategy. And then in this part, we're looking at the idea of external silencing. So the consequences of speaking out, because there are consequences for academic women when they do not remain silent. So this first example illustrates how women who try to be heard are in turn silenced. So on the promotions committee, there are 3 women, 4 men. Every time a woman tries to speak, the men start jumping in and attacking. You see this is the type of atmosphere we have, and unless something is done about it. So what is implied in this observation is that women academics are not able to fully express their views. The men start jumping in, nor are their views even considered, but rather attacked. And the atmosphere is depicted of one of aggression in a context, a promotions committee, where the stakes are incredibly high. So the interviewee goes on to comment that a very strong chair is needed to make sure that women are allowed to speak and not be silenced by their male colleagues. And she quotes a bit later on in the interview saying, would you go into a bar with a lot of racists? Women are turned off by this. And in this next quotation from the same interviewee, we see the accumulative effect of micro-inequities. And so she's saying, unless these types of very small things, these micro-inequities that sort of happen, drip, 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 drip effect, if they're not taken into account, women check out after a while because they say, I don't want to deal with these nonsenses. You guys want to fight over these things, you do it right, but we're not interested. And I think that's part of the problem. So here the effect is academic women just checking out. Now our next example describes the consequences of a female scientist speaking out. Now this interviewee had been given the responsibility of managing the lab, and a disagreement arose between herself and a male colleague who she describes as a white older man in age but not seniority. The disagreement related to the correct use of a machine in the lab. And her male colleague, she asked this particular colleague not to use the machine in that way because it was making it then very difficult for other scientists to use it. He refused, and so the interviewee had to speak to a line manager and perhaps ask him to deal with it. And she reports that in the lab the next day her colleague refused to help with anything, and that the day after she arrived to a message on her desk the next morning while she'd been out the lab overnight. Yes, so he wrote, "You told on me, that's why I'm not going to help you," in black Sharpie marker on my desk. And I thought it was very immature. And I wouldn't do this if I was a white male, right? And then she talks about the other remarks he's making. Oh, you're just a puppet, you don't have any power. And so the interviewee then goes on to further reflect on the consequences of not conforming to gender stereotypes and not being silent. I'll just give you a moment to read that. And I can tell you that to be called strong woman in Chinese is not good. It's not a positive comment. So we see the consequences of this transgression, the way in which this particular interviewee feels sort of labelled, stereotyped, because of the fact that she doesn't remain silent, she does speak out. And she talks about being closed down, again, conversationally, when she tries to speak. And the positioning of her as a confident academic woman as aggressive, a bitch. Now, if we go back to this issue of fixing the women, I think this is where the problem lies. Because it's far from straightforward. When women exhibit masculine characteristics, they are demonized. So to sort of train women to be assertive, to, have all those characteristics that they're seen as having to have, is problematic, because when they do, then there's a consequence. So it's almost you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't. Now, further examples of women being silenced include the interviewee who spoke out critically in a public context. And I actually saw this person speak out critically on a gender issue. She spoke very well. But I didn't realise, I didn't actually interview her. It was only when I looked at the transcript that I sort of put the pieces together, that she, after that, this public sort of, comment, she received a telephone call. And the person said to you, I wish I could say the Cantonese for you, it would sound really nice, seal your mouth. You should just seal your mouth. That's what the person on the end of the phone said. And the same interviewee goes on to talk about when she spoke to her line manager about contract renewal. So she didn't have, a permanent contract. And her line manager informed her it was unlikely that she would be granted it, the reason being given, again, I wish I could say the Cantonese, it translates as, frankly speaking, you are such an eyesore. So, silencing academic women can also be achieved simply by ignoring them, and then sometimes attributing what they do say to their male colleagues. So one interviewee said, some of the male colleagues would say exactly the same thing, and the whole group will just go, oh yeah, that's a really good point, blah, 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 blah. And this happens to all of us. It's just ridiculous. And this interviewee goes on to comment that she did not see the actions of her male colleagues as intentional at all, but raises an incredibly important point in relation to articulating micro inequities. I think if you brought it up, it's very awkward, because when you bring it up, you just seem like you're petulant, like you're saying, I said that point before, why didn't everybody listen to me? It's a very awkward spot to be in. And again, it goes back to this idea that micro inequities at the individual level, people can see them as, why is that person so sensitive? So that's why I think it's important to acknowledge individual acts of micro inequities, but then we need to look at them at the aggregate level to actually understand the power that they hold. So we've talked in this part about external silencing and talked about the consequences of speaking out. And now this external silencing, the notion of silence simply by exclusion. And it can manifest itself in numerous ways, and in a sense, women almost become invisible. So the following quotation from a female scientist refers to being in a minority, and it's the absence of larger numbers of women that leads to this sort of marginalised status. So just the numbers alone, whether it be in certain disciplines, or whether you go and sort of up the leadership rank, if you like, where women drop off. And I like this because, again, I think it comes back to this micro inequities, these micro politics, because she talks about it's a feeling. It's something I can feel, but at some points I can't quite put my finger on it. But for her, the first point is just the numbers alone. So they have 2 women scientists out of 20 scientists in their department. And she's saying sometimes we're not included in the discussion. But is it because we're junior? Is it because we are women? She then goes on to further reflect because her husband's in the same department. And during the interview, she comes to the realisation, actually, that no, what she sees is her male colleagues going into each other's offices down this corridor, and the doors get shut, and that her husband's been party to these closed-door conversations, but herself and the other female scientist have not been included in any of the discussions that are going on along the corridor. And here we see this awareness of minority status and not being represented on important decision-making forums. So she's talking here about the committees, and particularly the research-related committees, which are incredibly important, and the distribution of money committees. Now, in the literature and from the empirical data we have, we know that there is a tendency for women to do a lot of work on committees, but often those committees that just don't have the same level of prestige as the ones from which they're excluded, which will be the research-related committees, the money-distributing committees. And here, again, this lack of critical mass. So in this context, it's about who's sitting on the panels. When there's an international search and they're appointing particularly senior members of the institutions, where are the women on the panels contributing to the decision making? And linked to this quotation, the absence of women on selection panels brings us to another key point, and that's namely the notion of selection panel bracket male members appointing in their own image. So the institution itself is highly patriarchal. You are going to surround yourself with the same sort of people who are like-minded, like personality, and have the same sort of agenda. And so this just keeps perpetuating itself. And so the ability of women, and women who do not fit the model of what I've described, that aggressive model, there's no room for them. Okay, so I've set out this conceptual framework, and I've sort of framed it around this notion of internal and external silencing. But I think it's important to think about the context. So obviously this is East Asia, And these small studies by Luke some time ago, she suggests that in this context, women's roles and conduct in public are framed by cultural expectations that places this premium on women as wives and mothers and homemakers, and that therefore their conduct in public is subdued, quiet and withdrawn. Now, when I first arrived in Hong Kong, I decided to start a sort of research agenda looking at the role of culture in the barriers to career progression for women academics. And so I was particularly focused on traditional Chinese culture and how that might impact on this concept of silence and silencing. So what I did was I asked the interviewees themselves who were part of this study, and as you see, I think 20 of the women were Chinese. I've also carried out a large-scale survey across all women academics in the Hong Kong sector, which was funded by the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education Research here in the UK, where I asked specifically, what do you think about this? These very statements, is this the case? And also, I was lucky enough, remember those 8 women, the 8 senior women? I was lucky to interview those women and ask them, what do you think about this? And also 5 of the vice-chancellors in Hong Kong. What do you think about this issue of Asian culture, traditional Chinese culture, impacting on this, on this idea of silence and silencing? And I think to sum up, there were strikingly mixed views as to whether Asian culture served as a barrier to women's progression. It was incredibly complicated. It wasn't just a simple yes, no. But what they were strongly saying, out of all that data, that the role of culture is only one aspect of what is a complex problem. And the most influential factors limiting women's potential were identified as power and patriarchy. And actually, I went in December to Hong Kong to present the findings of this survey. And the audience there, again, a lot of Asian women themselves were saying, no, we don't want to overstate the role of culture here. It's the culture of gender that actually matters. Because for them, it was like, no, it's an easy let off. Oh, it's just traditional Chinese society. They were saying, no, that's not it. It's gender that they felt was really important. So my concluding thoughts then. So in introducing this conceptual framework, I think I'm arguing for micro-inequities to be taken a lot more seriously when we're thinking about the limits and barriers that academic women face. And again, back to Brennan, she's sort of making the case that you can't legislate for it. You can't even really go into self-regulation, because she writes at length about how these actions, these micro-inequities, often occur below the level of conscious decision-making. But what she does say is, I think we need to raise awareness of it, so that maybe, people are more aware when, look at those examples we've looked at, a greater awareness of those. And I think the study of micro-inequities and micro-politics provide an insight into why legislation, policies, initiatives are not as successful as they might be. I mean, here in the UK, we've had, well, some decades actually, of legislation, policies, initiatives. We've got Athena Swan, but there are still problems. And I think progress is sort of stalled, if you like. We still have an issue with women making that transition into the role of full professor and into the most senior leadership roles in the profession. And I like this quote by Louise: underpinning much of the understanding of micropolitics is this elusive sense that something is going on which cannot be satisfactorily named or described. And what I'm saying is, maybe this conceptual framework of silence and silencing is a further step forward towards naming that which cannot be named. Okay, thank you very much.